Mr Fallon, in the last, I suppose, 2 years, the government has responded to flat economic growth with respect to manufacturing by launching a whole range of schemes, including a 5-point industrial strategy, the Advanced Manufacturing Supply Chain Initiative, the Regional Growth Fund, more funding for the Technology Strategy Board we saw recently from David Willetts, the Catapult, and the list goes on. I mean, in the whole round, are you satisfied that you've got the balance right with these instruments, and what are your metrics for their success?
Well, we watch the success of these various schemes the whole time. It's not just schemes; it's also funding. We've been able to support industry right across the regions. It's very important to try and rebalance the economy. What are the measures of success? Well, partly the take-up, to see how many applications there are. As we've got into the fourth round of the Regional Growth Fund, for example, we've had many more applications than we did when the fund was new, and that is true of quite a lot of the schemes. So we look at the take-up. We also look at the number of jobs created, the amount of private sector investment that leveraged in as well, and then overall the gross value added. So there are some key metrics we look at very carefully, and if schemes aren't successful, then we're always prepared to look at them and adjust them.
Yeah. I suppose alongside that question, there's a question about how well they're marketed and communicated to the target audiences. I know we're here today at the National Manufacturing Debate with several stakeholders such as EEF and Cranfield University themselves. But in your view, do you think the funds and the programmes and initiatives are being adequately communicated to the target audience?
Well, this government had an overall ban on excessive marketing spend when it came into office, because the previous government spent an awful lot of money on television advertising and a lot of wasteful marketing. So it was very difficult to get sufficient budgets to market these schemes originally. But we are looking at that very hard now to make sure there's more awareness of these schemes. And we are promoting them with our key stakeholders, such as the industry itself and the universities. And I think we've seen now a much greater awareness of schemes like the Advanced Manufacturing Supply Chain Initiative, the Regional Growth Fund, because we're getting many more applications.
And on that particular fund, did you say in your presentation earlier that there's another round of funding of £120 million coming through for the AMSCI fund specifically?
Yes, we've had the first 2 rounds, and we've now announced funding for rounds 3 and 4, which will take us well into next year. And there's an enormous amount of interest in that, and we're expecting a lot of bids.
And that's really specifically to help SMEs, perhaps more than larger companies, isn't it?
Yes, it's designed to strengthen the supply chain, particularly in advanced manufacturing. So it's a very specific, targeted form of help. But again, we had quite a big response to the first rounds, and we're holding workshops around the country to promote rounds 3 and 4, and we're getting a lot of interest in it.
Now, perhaps the sort of one perennial topic or subject for manufacturing support in these type of conferences, Raj, is access to finance. That's been a big, the elephant in the room, I guess, for the last 3 or 4 years. And evidence to date shows that perhaps the funding for lending scheme hasn't really increased net lending to businesses by as much as it would like to have done, where perhaps mortgage lending has dominated more in that FLS scheme. So Raj or Michael, are you confident that the recent changes to the funding for lending scheme, where banks are actually incentivised to siphon more of this money to SMEs than to mortgage lenders, will make a material difference to the amount smaller firms can borrow?
Maybe I could start. I've been talking to a few banks independently, in terms of manufacturing investment. One thing I do hear from banks, that SMEs often struggle to actually apply and seek funding because of lack of resources internally. So they need help to prepare the application and see it through the system to attract the funding. So that's often the issue. Not always, issue is not about actually lack of funding. I think issue is about ability of some of our SMEs to seek that funding properly.
I see.
And that's why many banks are now working with SMEs to help them to apply for funding properly.
Okay, so the banks are engaging more with SMEs to help them complete application forms, give them a better chance of successfully receiving bank funding or bank lending. But do you think, Mr Fallon, that with respect to the changes to the funding for lending scheme, where now I think for every £10 of allowance from FLS, provided as long as the bank can siphon £1 to an SME, the allowance is increased, I believe. Do you think that's going to make a material difference to the amount of money that SMEs receive?
Well, I hope so. It's something that the Secretary of State and I have been discussing with the banks, with the Bank of England in particular. When the Funding for Lending scheme was launched, it did not distinguish between lending for business and lending for the housing market. And of course, it's much easier for the banks to lend to the housing market because they have to set much less capital against that lending. So, of course, we've seen initially money from Funding for Lending going into the mortgage market rather than the SME market, and that's what we need to correct. And if I can take up the Professor's point, we also need to make sure that SMEs feel that these lending schemes are for them as well. And they need help with the applications. He's quite right about that. We also need to tackle the perception that it's kind of not worth even asking, that you're going to be turned down by your bank. We need to get over that, and we need the banks to be much more proactive about the way they use the schemes, to publicise the appeal system if you are turned down, and to remind small businesses that it is worth going along to ask.
Do you think there are signs that you see that companies are overcoming that hurdle that perhaps 12 months ago they were less inclined to go to a bank because they felt that the answer would be no? Now they're more adventurous and perhaps more optimistic about the chance of being lent money?
I think it's too early to say that. I'd be interested in the Professor's view. I don't find that yet. I still think we've got an issue, and we still have a debate. The banks say the demand for finance isn't there from the SMEs. The SMEs tell me they can't, they get turned down or they can't apply or whatever. And indeed, the fact that they are asking me for the money, they're coming to the government for all these various loans and grants, tells me there is something not yet right about SME lending. So we need to keep pushing the big banks, and the big banks have 85% of this market, but we also need to encourage alternative sources of finance, which we're doing through the business bank.
Okay. And I think that alternative sources of funding, which could come from large companies to support their suppliers, could be very useful for SMEs, because their customers know their language and they can actually provide a better financial support in some cases than commercial banks.
Sure.
And I think that's already seen in aerospace sector in many companies. And I would like to see that that's strengthened through business bank.
Now, while access to finance is still a very real issue for companies, particularly manufacturers, some people say that the bigger finance problem is really late payments, where certainly for SMEs, some of their customers are very large companies, and payment terms of 90 days or more are quite normal. This throttles cash flow and ultimately undermines the competitiveness of the manufacturing sector because SMEs have no cash to invest in capital equipment. Does the government recognise this problem, and do you think the new regulations, I think, that came out in March, derived from the EU Late Payments Directive, will help fix the problem?
Well, we certainly do recognise the problem, and it is very unfair on small businesses that, in effect, large companies who are already sitting on quite a lot of cash can use small companies as a source of finance through not settling invoices promptly. We've encouraged the bigger companies to sign up to the prompt payment code. There's been a very welcome increase in the number who have, and that means they must comply with the code and keep to their commitments. Government does the same, pays promptly. But we also need to encourage more generally, I think, a move away from 90 days. I really don't see why any invoice can't be paid within 30 days. And that really should be the norm. And that's what's encouraged under the European legislation.
Good.
Thank you.
Now, a lot of manufacturing investment in the advanced engineering and power generation space is being held up by negotiations over the strike price for electricity generated by new nuclear, offshore wind, etc. Now, that's important to get that right because, of course, it affects consumer prices. But when it comes to balancing the needs for the consumer and the electorate for affordable energy against the need for jobs and growth in the power generation sector, do you think government is giving enough weight to the latter?
Well, we certainly need to give proper weight to the latter, and that's extremely important because our energy prices here need to be competitive, particularly competitive in Western Europe, and of course our industry faces the challenge of much cheaper energy across in the United States. There has been some uncertainty while we put the regulatory framework in place, while we put the legislation, the energy bill, which is now going through Parliament. But you will see this summer, hopefully, a deal over Hinkley, and we will publish the strike price there. And then you will see draft contracts for difference published, I hope, before the middle of the summer for investment in other areas, so that we will have now more certainty. So this year will be the year, I think, we get the legislation in place, the regulatory framework, and investors, potential investors, will have much more clarity about how they will be repaid for their investment.